as you know, the big story this week in terms of the international onslaught on Israel is that National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir went up on the Temple Mount on Tuesday morning, very early, and immediately the international chorus of Israel condemners came down on Israel like a pile of bricks. The United States, Tom Nides, the U.S. ambassador here condemned. The White House National Security Council spokesman condemned. Britain condemned, EU condemned, the UAE, Israel's peace partner, condemned. Everybody seemed to think that this was absolutely the worst thing to ever happen. The UAE petitioned, it's now the rotating member of the UN Security Council, for a special session of the UN Security Council to talk about this terrible, diabolical thing that Itamar Ben-Gvir, a senior minister in the Israeli government, went up to the most holy site in all of the Jewish world, in all of Judaism, the Temple Mount, and walked around for a whole 13 minutes before he came down. They claimed that this was a walking away and abrogation of the status quo in the Temple Mount, which is a total lie. And therefore it's horrible, and the most important thing is the status quo. Of course, they never said this when the Palestinians started praying in the Dome of the Rock in the 1970s, which was against the status quo, or when they built two illegal mosques on the Temple Mount in 1996 and in 1988, destroying unbelievable quantities of irreplaceable antiquities from the temple period, threw them into garbage dumps around Jerusalem, and then undermined the foundations of the Temple Mount, and then built a fourth mosque in 2019. In the 2000s, they actually put floor tiles all over the mount, and all of these things undermine the structural durability of the Temple Mount and of the antiquities below. So from a scientific perspective, from a construction perspective, from all of these perspectives, these things are devastating for the site, for Judaism's holiest site. And yet, when an Israeli minister goes up on the Temple Mount for 13 minutes, that's what people find condemnatory, and that is what they condemn, and all hell is breaking loose. So this is not the first time that we've seen something like this, obviously. We see it all the time. We see it so often that it almost becomes second nature to just assume that any time that Jews in any way whatsoever assert their rights to be alive and breathe in unified Jerusalem, in Judea and Samaria, and even in parts of Israel like the Negev and the Galilee that are now being overtaken by Arab, often jihadists, we're condemned for it. We've gotten so used to it that it almost seems like nothing. So I thought that the person to talk about this phenomenon, which I think is a very important, maybe the key phenomenon of our times, that anything that Jews do that in any way asserts ownership, sovereignty in the land of Israel, immediately foments an international gang rape of Israel in international forums and bilateral relations, is Professor Richard Landis. Professor Richard Landis is a medieval historian, and he has spent over the past 20 years, more than the past 20 years, really since 2000 and on, studying the blood libel and its contemporary form against Israel. And he just put out this extremely important book called Can the Whole World Be Wrong? Can the Whole World Be Wrong? Lethal Journalism, Anti-Semitism, and the Global Jihad, from Academic Press. So first of all, Professor Richard Landau, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you.
First of all, congratulations, or second of all, I said first of all, thanks for being here. Second of all, congratulations on this really important book. I know it's been, how long did it take you to write this thing?
Over a decade.
Over a decade, yeah. I can tell just from reading it that it was a labor of love and bitterness in a way.
Yeah.
I just want to start this discussion with what I found to be sort of almost a summary quote of your thesis here from your book. It goes like this. You're talking about the Muhammad al-Dura blood libel from October of 2000, which we're going to talk about. Don't worry, that's the first thing we're going to talk about. But you right here. The conjuncture of jihadi demands and progressive enthusiasm for the inverted narrative lies at the heart of the current malaise of the West. In 2000, on a wave of misinformation from our jihadi-intimidated narrative journalists, the al-Dura blood libel introduced these moral and cognitive inversions into discussions in our public sphere. The moral sadism of calling Israel the new Nazis when no army behaved less like the Nazis, and calling the Palestinians the new Jews when they openly claimed they wanted to be the new Nazis became the new normal. So let's first of all remind everybody, your book goes through, just like it says, lethal journalism, anti-Semitism, and the global jihad. And I think that you see these three things as the pillars of the age of madness and the suicide of Western civilization that we're now in the midst of. So let's talk a second or a while. Let's talk a few minutes about the Muhammad al-Dura incident. So can you just, for everybody who doesn't live this stuff all the time.
And who doesn't, and who was born afterwards.
Yeah, 22 years ago,
in
can
a
you
sense,
believe
this
it?
book is addressed to people who were born into the world created by that blood libel, which was, in my read, the first successful blood libel in the West since the Holocaust. Up until that point, they were more traditional. This is a postmodern blood libel. It's based on, as you point out, narrative journalism, or I call it lethal journalism, which is essentially, I define lethal journalism as a form of war journalism. There's patriotic, which is reporting your own side's propaganda as news. Lethal journalism is when it's a remote war and you report one side's war propaganda as news, which is what the Western journalists did certainly from the beginning of the Intifada. And then there's own goal war journalism, in which you report your enemy's war propaganda as news to your own people, which is essentially what people were doing when they were making lethal journalism, doing lethal journalism against Israel.
Let's set it up. It was Netzarim Junction in the Gaza Strip. This is Israel withdrew 5 years later.
This is 2 days after Sharon is on the Temple Mount, and there were riots. And in fact, we know from subsequent remarks that his visit to the Temple Mount was a trap, and that Yasser Arafat was planning the riots that would ensue as a result of his visit.
Right. So let me just step back one more step, which is July 2000. So we're talking 2 months earlier. What happened was we had the Camp David summit, where then Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak went to Camp David with President Clinton, and Yasser Arafat
made massive concessions about Jerusalem that shocked everybody, and Arafat still said no.
So this was supposed to be the end. This was supposed to be the final settlement of the Palestinian conflict with Israel.
Right.
The Palestinians were offered almost every single thing that they claimed they wanted in order to be appeased. Little thing here, little thing there, and Arafat rejected it, and he didn't offer a counteroffer, and he walked away. And then when he walked away, he said to Omar Barghouti, the head of the Fatah movement, who's in jail now, he said to him, "Prepare for war." And we had a whole bunch of other. Faisal Husseini explained that the whole Oslo peace process from 1993 until then had been a Trojan horse to bring in the Palestinian war.
Arafat himself had said that it was the Treaty of Hudaybiyah.
But that was
we're weak. We make the treaty as soon as we can. We
break it.
The soldiers come out of the Trojan horse.
And then he started calling for jihad when he came back from Camp David. So he rejected peace and he called for jihad. And September 28th, 2000, Sharon, who was, I think, the opposition leader at the time, he went up to the Temple Mount, much as Ben-Gvir went on Tuesday, January 3rd, and all hell breaks loose. And so we have rioting all over Israel. We have rioting in Judea and Samaria, in Gaza, and in Jaffa.
In Jaffa.
And then we have this incident where, again, Israel is still in military control of Gaza. We have the Gush Katif communities in southern Gaza Strip. And Netzarim Junction is a key junction in Gaza. It's a key traffic artery. You have an Israeli military detail in a pillbox, right? At the junction, overseeing what's happening, and you have rioting on the ground.
Right.
Right. Okay.
So they come out and demonstrate, and I was privileged, largely because I don't think Charles al-Dura understood what was going on when he let me in, because he only let friends see the footage. But I got to see the footage of that day, and most of it is just, Palestinians standing around, kids standing around in front of the Israeli position, burning tires, throwing rocks. Completely unafraid of the Israelis. And then there are scenes of sort of fake injury, and people carry people out to ambulances and stuff. But there was literally no serious stuff going on until all of a sudden, at about 3 o'clock, we see fire coming from the Palestinian position. Allegedly, we see fire coming from the Israeli position. And then you have this drama of a boy who dies in his father's lap, allegedly shot by the Israelis on purpose in a hail of bullets. Bullets like rain, says the cameraman, Charles al-Dura's France 2 cameraman, bullets like rain. And he sends this footage, which is really shoddy stuff. You can see it at the website al-Dura.com, ALDURAH.com. It's 60 seconds. It's 9 different takes instead of running his camera, which he said he was running out of batteries. He takes these takes, and then they're put together. The last scene where the boy raises his elbow and looks out is cut. al-Dura says, I cut it because it was the death throes and it was too hard to bear. In fact, it was too hard to bear for his narrative, since he had already announced the kid dead 2 takes earlier. And this then takes in the media in a way that is absolutely astonishing.
So wait, let me just to clarify. So what happened was, there's a scene. It's
pretty clearly staged.
It's staged,
like so much else.
And France 2, which is a state television broadcaster of France, has this exclusive footage, right, from this scene, which is canned footage, right? And they take this footage, and what do they do with it?
They edit it, and they broadcast it that evening without checking. In fact, al-Dura called the IDF Dover Tzahal and said, I have footage, don't try and deny it. The best thing you can do is apologize.
Is this Erev Rosh Hashanah?
This is Erev Rosh Hashanah. So, a young guy is there in charge. He doesn't know what's going on. And then al-Dura runs it. And the next day, the pressure is on everybody to run it. I have a friend who worked in CNN. And apparently, the new head of CNN said no to the footage because it was pretty clearly. But then the next day, the pressure's on him to line up with the France 2. So this narrative of the Israelis deliberately, in cold blood, shooting down this Palestinian boy in his father's arms, with the father pleading to them to stop, makes the rounds throughout the West.
There's something else that's interesting about it, right? Which is that France 2, aside from the pressure came from the fact that France 2 released it for free, right? They
gave everybody the tape.
Which is different from normal practice, right?
Absolutely.
What would normal practice be?
Normal practice is if you've got what's it called when you get you've got
an exclusive scoop.
An exclusive, you don't give out the footage.
People have to pay for it.
But he wanted people to pile on. I don't know if you've seen the movie Wall Street, but there are ways in which you can literally create a rush, and that's what he wanted. He wanted to create an avalanche in favor of this narrative. And it had a double effect. It had a mythical effect. It had a mythical effect in the Muslim world because it was proof that the infidel is killing innocent Muslims. And Bin Laden immediately made it the centerpiece of a recruiting movie that he made a couple of months after the incident. This is before 9/11. This is a year before 9/11. So it was a call to jihad in the Muslim world. In the West, it was the key to Holocaust inversion. So you have a French journalist who's well respected and not particularly flaky, who, she doesn't work for l'Humanité and stuff. And she says, shortly after this footage comes out, this image erases the picture of the boy in the Warsaw Ghetto, right? So, and that's what I mean when I say both moral and empirical disorientation. You can't get more disoriented than that. You've got really poor footage of one kid killed, and that replaces a picture that symbolizes the deliberate roundup and murder of 1 million children. What planet are you on? Well, you're on planet 21st century, because that then becomes the new norm.
So this goes out, and I remember also the Daniel Pearl beheading video.
They used that footage, yes. That was 2002, but
right.
Even before that, he was as a medievalist, I can say this, he was the patron saint of Durban. His body was carried in effigy. His father was flown there by Arafat in a jet. They had T-shirts of him everywhere.
Right.
So he really became, and he became.
And Durban was. So if al-Dura was a setup, this was the Christian boy that we made Passover matzahs out of, but it was
a Muslim boy
that the Israeli Nazis murdered as if it was the Warsaw Ghetto. And by the way, we continued to get the concentration camp imagery, an open air concentration camp,
No,
and Jihad is the Warsaw. Jenin is the Warsaw Ghetto 2 years later. So we get, this is sort of the beginning of the mass usage of Holocaust inversion that you're talking, but Durban. So Durban was kind of the intellectual, if you want to call it that. It was like the Wannsee conference almost. It was where you got the diplomatic and intellectual NGO imprimatur for what they were doing, and
it is the marriage of the radical left and radical left is unfortunately a poor term for it. The left and the jihadis.
Right.
It is the red-green marriage.
Okay, so I actually want to get to that almost immediately. I just want our viewers who, again, don't live this all the time to understand that in September, a year later, in August, September, like a week before 9/11, August, September 2001, the Palestinians, after al-Dura, we had a year here of the beginning of the Palestinian terrorist war, where we started getting
suicide terror war.
Suicide bombings in buses, in cafes, on highway junctions, roadside shootings of Israelis, and we had over 100 murdered by this point of Israelis, overwhelmingly civilians, by Palestinian suicide bombers in Judea and Samaria and throughout the country. So, and we had a major bombing in August of 2001, just before the Durban conference, or maybe even while it was going on, at the Sparrow Pizzeria in Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, which had 15 people killed, 8 of whom were children. A terrorist bomber went into the pizzeria guided by a woman named Alam Tamimi, who's now yucking it up in Amman, Jordan, as the guest of King Abdallah, but that's neither here nor there. Anyway, so massacre in Sparrow, and then just a few days later, we had this UN conference against xenophobia, racism, hatred, and other racism, forms of horrible things. And it was supposed to be almost the global expression of what former President George H.W. Bush had called the New World Order. After the end of the Cold War, all of the nations were supposed to get together. There was supposed to be a global governing solution to all of the world's problem, and its seat of government was going to be the UN. And by convening this conference at Durban, the heart of apartheid South Africa and post-apartheid South Africa, we were showing the new face of the 20th century, of the global community, 21st century, of the global community. And instead of having some sort of a positive message, the Durban conference became the way to codify this new scapegoating of the Jews, this new demonization of the Jewish people, and the new criminalization of the Jews through their nation state, the state of Israel. Is that an apt summary? What would you add to that?
Yes, what I'd add to that is that as a medieval historian, one of my fields, one of my specialties is apocalyptic beliefs. And essentially what happened there was that the left and the West signed on to a jihadi apocalyptic scenario in which the Antichrist was both Israel, the great and little Satan, Israel and the United States. Mm-hmm. And so by signing on to this, first of all, they got a huge shot in the arm. I mean, the Palestinian cause doesn't even appear in the 1999 demonstrations against the globalization and capitalism and so on. They're not even on the screen. And then all of a sudden in 2001, after al-Dura, it is front and center the main cause. And so, again, it's kind of own goal thinking in which you are adopting your enemy's apocalyptic scenario in which you are the target.
So what's interesting there also, right, I think that what you said is an essential point, that the international left, the Red-Green Alliance, emerged from Durban, and you had anti-American Americans like Jesse Jackson and others who went to Durban and were part of this NGO convention. You had Colin Powell from the Bush administration, was then Secretary of State. He pulled the United States out of the conference because because of the final declaration that declared Israel an apartheid state. So the Bush administration, the official sort of middle of the road, sane voice. I mean, Bush was not a pro-Israel president by any stretch of the imagination, but he was sane.
There were limits to his insanity.
And so Colin Powell, who later became the first American Secretary of State to officially endorse the establishment of a Palestinian state, just 2 months later in November of 2001, he walked away from the Durban conference. He pulled the U.S. delegation out. But you had these other Americans at the conference. There were two conferences, the state conference and the NGO conference.
And the NGO conference
and
was the real driver.
And what you're saying is that the 1979 Islamic Revolution, right, which was the first jihadist revolution that we saw, I think.
Yes, which is incidentally 1400 in the Muslim calendar. And they have a tradition of apocalyptic movements around the century turn.
Okay, so 1979, the Islamic Revolution, and they come out and they declare war against the great Satan, the United States of America, and the little Satan, the state of Israel. And what you're saying is that 22 years later, in September of 2001, the left signs on to officially signs on at Durban to this conceptual framework of the Islamic Revolution of Iran.
And as a result, you can get something like Judith Butler in 2006 after the Lebanon War saying that Hezbollah and Hamas, and mind you, she claims she's a pacifist, Hezbollah and Hamas are part of the global progressive left because they're anti-American imperialism. They're anti-imperialist because they're anti-American, whereas they're the most ferocious imperialists on the planet. But as far as she's concerned, the only thing she sees is the Antichrist, United States and Israel.
Okay, I want to go from there. So we're just going to jump. So you had these two sort of critical moments. You had
and add Jenin to that.
Jenin is a year later. It's in April 2002.
And it's the implementation of what Durban was calling for, which was the stigmatization, the pariah, rendering pariah Israel.
And in between, so you had al-Dura in October 1st, 2000. You have Sharon goes up to the Temple Mount September 28th, 2000. 2 days later, October 1st.
Oh, September 30th.
What?
It's okay.
Never mind.
Yeah, al-Dura is 2 days later, right?
September 30th, you have al-Dura. And then you have then you have a year later in
August, September, Durban.
and then you have in
September 11th.
September 11th we haven't spoken about,
Right.
and in 2002, after Israel had undergone now 2 years or a year and a half of massive terrorism. There were over 100 people who were killed in the 1 month of March 2002, caused Ariel Sharon, was then prime minister, to order the IDF to carry out what became known as Operation Defensive Shield, where the Israeli military went in and restored Israeli security control over the Palestinian population center.
And in my book, I present that as the first campaign of a democracy against suicide terror literally the first campaign against suicide terror, and the world lined up on the Palestinian side because journalists were reporting completely unverified accounts of the Israelis behaving like Nazis, of massacring people and burying them in mass graves.
So there was this huge battle in the Jenin refugee camp in August of 2002.
Actually, very contained. It was like 5 square blocks.
Right, and it was a horrible pitched battle from house to house
For 3
because
weeks.
Israel was so afraid of the lethal journalism you talk about that it refused to bomb from the air, so that our reservists who were doing the fighting
23
were exposed. So you had 23 reservists who were killed in the battle, and you had about 55 terrorists who were killed.
Well,
so
you had 52 to 56 Palestinians, 40 of whom were combatants. So that's a 3-to-1 combatant to civilian ratio in urban warfare, which is absolutely unheard of. And the world hears the story of the Jenin massacre,
which was the Warsaw Ghetto uprising of our times.
Right.
So and the Jews were the suicide bombers who had booby trapped literally every single building in the camp. And by the way, they call it a refugee camp, but that's a misnomer because it's really just a normal urban neighborhood. In fact, it's a nice one.
Jenin, right.
So that's that. So you have this decision, and now where do you come into this? How are you looking at all of this, and how, why, and why? So first of all, you, and then why?
So at the time, already towards the end of the process in the 1990s, I began to feel that there was something awry about this peace process. But I didn't expect it to blow up. When Arafat said, no, I work a lot, again, as a medievalist, on honor-shame culture, and it was clear to me, I have a section in the chapter on honor-shame here about the Palestinians and why Arafat, for reasons of honor, couldn't say yes, because negotiation is a form of weakness, and making sacrifices to get something but not getting it all is a sign of weakness, and he could not say yes. And the West was, I have a chapter on cognitive egocentrism, which is projecting your mentality onto others, and liberals project their positive sum mentality onto others, and then they're shocked when they don't do the rational thing. Anyway, so when the Intifada breaks out, I remember seeing the picture of Muhammad Adu and thinking, oh, it's all over. I'm not going to be able to argue for Israel with a picture like this out there. And then in 2003, I was going to France for research at the Bibliothèque Nationale, the manuscripts, and somebody said, I was on the committee of the American Jewish Committee, the media committee. Somebody said, get in touch with Nidra Polar. She has access to the original footage. So I got in touch with Nidra Polar.
Nidra is an American Jewish journalist living in France for
Paris,
now.
and who is still a friend today, which is not easy in the al-Dura community. And so I go to see her, and she brings me, and I look at the footage, and it's immediately clear to me that this is staged. And then I get to see the stuff with al-Dura. So in a sense, I put my medieval work on hold while I proceeded to investigate this really bizarre fake that had taken the West by storm. And of course, I think it did a lot of damage to my career because I was accused of being a conspiracy theorist and so on. I even forget the name of the people who did that. But in any case, it was a tough row to hoe. I made the movie Pallywood,
Right.
and I made it because when I would talk to people about al-Dura, I'd say there are five possibilities. The Israelis killed him on purpose. The Israelis killed him by accident. The Palestinians killed him by accident. The Palestinians killed him on purpose, and a fifth. And people were so committed to the kid was killed that they would say the ambulance driver, the journalists, it never occurred to them that this could be a fake.
That he was alive.
Well, I don't know if he's alive. We don't know what happened to him afterwards. We know that the body that was buried had no relationship to the picture of the boy we were told was Muhammad al-Dura.
The footage of
the funeral scene. There was a German facial recognition expert who said this is nothing. This is not the boy in the picture that were being given by the family as the boy who was killed in the. So I made Pallywood because I wanted people first to realize that it was not only standard for the Palestinians to fake footage, but that it was standard for Western journalists to take this footage and clean it up, which is exactly what Al-Dura did with the al-Dura footage. So I came out with that, and I had some success. Now Pallywood is a well-known term, but never in order to face what the media did with al-Dura would take a level of self-reflection and bring about a change that would, in my mind, be enormously beneficial to the West, because it would literally staunch this lethal journalism that continues to destroy our ability to understand what's going on. But I, up until now, haven't succeeded. So this book is an attempt to sort of lay it out. The first 5 years of the 21st century, al-Dura and the Intifada, which I call the Oslo Jihad, 9/11, Jenin, and the Danish cartoon scandal. And there you can see essentially the taking of a mindset that literally doesn't get it. So the original title of the book was They're So Smart Because We're So Stupid.
So that's really the question. That's good, but can the whole world be wrong? You said is a quote that you ascribed to Ahad Ha'am, Asher Ginsburg,
Right.
the
Yes,
Zionist,
he wrote an essay called it.
Right, and he was talking about, can the whole world be wrong, essentially about the Jews, about the blood libel.
About the blood libel.
But it's also about the Jews, because the blood libel is about demonizing
Right.
the Jews. And the answer is yes, and the question is, there are so many questions, but the main question is why? Why? I mean, this is so devastating to the West.
Yeah. There's a joke, allegedly, it appeared in a movie, and I think people say, I haven't been able to find it, that anyway, Isaiah Berlin said that anti-Semitism is hating Jews more than absolutely necessary.
Right, exactly.
So, but in the 21st century, anti-Semitism is hating Jews even though it's killing you. Because literally, to adopt this narrative coming from the Palestinians, which clearly makes a lot of progressives feel good. I remember talking with one guy who was a liberal, he was anti-war, the whole thing, and he kept saying, this time Israel's lost the moral high ground.
Like happily.
Yeah, like happily, Well, he was saying it sadly to me because he knew I was Israeli, but it was clear. I was trying to figure out. So that's when actually I coined the term moral schadenfreude, which is sort of the thrill that you get by the moral degradation of people that you resent, and that's the Jews. So you've got this.
So is it anti-Semitism? Is it the obsessive compulsive?
Yeah. So
Jew
some
hatred?
of it unquestionably. Others of it is actually, and this comes back to the Temple Mount story you discussed at the beginning. It's fear of Muslims. In other words, when you get all these apocalyptic prophecies from the experts that if you move the embassy to Jerusalem or if Ben Gvir goes up on the Temple Mount, there will be an explosion and an intifada and who knows how bad it's going to get. Basically, they're adopting the narrative of Muslims who are threatening violence in order to get their way, and they're giving them their way preemptively. So I actually coined another term in the book. I call it preemptive dhimmitude.
Right.
Which is
It's a great term.
You behave like a dhimmi. You don't criticize Muslims. You attack people who criticize Muslims. You behave like a dhimmi in the hopes that Muslims won't feel the need to conquer you and make you a real dhimmi. And I think that many, if not most, of the people in high positions in the West today are operating under in the fear of that's the magnet under the table, but above the table it lines up as a sort of post-colonial ideology, which I think is a fig leaf for the cowardice that these people are showing vis-a-vis people who are openly proclaiming they're our enemies.
Let me give you a theory I've been working on for the past week and see whether we can flesh it out, or you can just tell me it's stupid. But Pope Benedict XVI just passed away,
Right.
and I couldn't help myself, even though I wanted to write an article about the new government and the pylon.
Right.
I just felt like I had to talk about Benedict for a second, because I think that his 2006 speech at Regensburg,
Right.
where he talked about the problem of Islam as, is this a faith that's tethered to reason, or is it not? And if it's not, then we can't really talk, can we? You can't reason with people who are driven only by their passions. And so, and so he, in a way, it was an invitation to the Muslim world to show that they were capable of tying Islam to reason and having a rational discussion in an interreligious dialogue. And of course, the jihadists responded by beheading a priest and killing a nun and burning churches.
And killing 20, 30 Muslims.
Yes, I mean, I think they killed, I when I was going over to write this column, I think I didn't see that. I had remembered that 15 Christians were killed, but I only wrote about the ones that I could find. But at any rate, so they went on this spasm of rage, murderous rage, killing the infidels in their wake, and Benedict apologized in a way, but he didn't actually apologize. I was looking at it, and he was terrific, but there was a sense that this was also an event. This was also an important event. Here's the head of the Catholic Church saying, come on, guys, be rational. We can't. Are you capable of rationality? And the left sided with the people who were beheading nuns.
Yes.
And
how could you insult them?
how you're an Islamophobe, and so it made me think. And this is my theory, that what everybody wonders about this red-green alliance, how can they possibly, their visions of utopia, of where they want to get to, are so disparate. There's no connection between them, but the path towards it, I think, is the same, because both the radical left, the woke revolutionaries, the progressives, and the jihadists reject reason, right? And they both have their impassioned beliefs, and where they change immutable truths into malleable states of being, male, female, biology, and then they take these things that are very clearly, preferences, like I want to be a transgendered, and they turn it into something immutable. So this is just reality on its head. That's not my words, by the way. Doug Murray, I saw him say it in an interview, and I thought it was so brilliant, I figured I'd steal it. But see, I can't steal it. I have to give him credit.
Or as Melanie says, the world turned upside down.
Yes, it's the world turned up, but it's an embrace of madness and a rejection of rationality. And so they have this joint path to get to their very different end states. And it's that path, that rejection of rationality, that makes them into anti-Americans, anti-Christians, and anti-Jewish, or that joins them in all of the things that they hate on the way to that.
Yes.
And then you look at somebody like Bush. And here's Bush. He's the president. He's an evangelical Christian, sort of, and he meets 9/11. Almost immediately after 9/11, he goes to the Washington Islamic Center, the mosque that is run by the Muslim Brotherhood,
Right.
which shares the ideology
With the
of
Muslim Brotherhood guy standing right to his left.
right, and one of I think a couple of them ended up in jail for inciting terrorism and jihad. I think Siddiqui was there, for instance. But so he's standing with these jihadists, and he declares Islam a religion of peace. And so you see, this is a guy, right? You know, he didn't have a problem going to the ruins of the World Trade Center and saying, "We're coming for them," right? But then he goes to them,
Right.
and he bows down to them.
Right.
How do you explain his behavior? I can understand a Judith Butler
Right,
or,
right,
all
right,
of these
right.
radical communists
So,
doing this.
yeah.
What explains Bush?
So it's interesting. I have a chapter on it in which the first issue I address is Bush's speech, and in which I say the jihadis could not have asked for a better speech from an infidel
Right.
leader whom they had just attacked, in which he basically immediately declared Islam innocent of anything to do with the 9/11 attacks. He didn't know anything about Islam, and then you have people like Kerry declaring that, the jihadis are heretics and that they're not true Islam. All these. I think this is all preemptive dhimmitude. And
But why would
okay,
Bush?
so the reason that Bush did it, and I actually heard Condoleezza Rice just this summer. There was a conference at Stanford at the Hoover Institute, and she was asked, when did Bush do something that was based on an understanding of history? The conference was about history. And she said, well, 9/11, he went and gave that speech. And why did he give that speech? He gave that speech because he knew what we did to the Japanese in World War II. And he didn't want to repeat that. And so I wrote her a letter, which she has yet to respond to, in which I
Shocking
said,
that she didn't respond.
yeah, in which I said, look, here's what I wrote, and I can understand not wanting to repeat what happened to the Japanese in World War II, but you don't have to go the other extreme.
But it's not only that. Ernie May, who was a professor at Harvard, a brilliant
Right.
historian, I TA'd for him when I was at the Kennedy School, and really, he wrote a small book called The Lessons of History, I think, or something like that, where he was talking about the misuse of analogies and how people take the wrong analogies
I call it analogic dyslexia.
and they don't understand history as a
right,
result.
right,
And so if
exactly.
you take the
wrong
American
one.
treatment of Japanese Americans,
As your
and
guide. Well, it's okay as a guide, but the point is he took it in the flattest way. And what I think he was doing was, and to this day, I mean, his daughter tweeted it as a reproach to Trump when Trump was making what was considered Islamophobic remarks. And to this day, you have people praising this speech. And even people on the conservative side praising the speech. And the reason is that they wanted to prevent a wave of revenge attacks against Muslims in America.
why was this their primary concern?
That was their primary
No,
concern.
that's the question.
Okay.
Why was that their primary concern? Why was it this idea that the problem was going to be the way that America responded to
That's
this, as opposed
interesting.
to why did these people do it to
Right.
America? Why do they?
Right.
Why?
Why is it?
Americans
why
didn't
was the
kill
question?
3,000
Why was the
Muslims.
question? Well, they claim that we killed a lot more than 3,000 Muslims. But the interesting thing is, there are two questions that get asked. One is, what makes them hate us so much? And the other is, what did we do to make them hate us so much?
Yeah, but
And
why
that
don't we
second
trust
one,
ourselves?
I
mean,
know.
why
Well,
did they think?
So I got to tell you, I talk about how the BBC and Reuters refused to use the term terrorism to describe what happened on 9/11. And in so doing, they were applying to America what they had already been applying to Israel during the 90s when the first round of terror attacks came. So, there were people who resisted. There were clear-headed thinkers, but over time, they lost ground. And the way I view it is, it's a little like, those samurai movies where the samurai master moves past somebody with a flash of the sword, and then you see a little trickle of blood, and then the head topples off. Well, we got cut off at the knees with the Muhammad al-Dura story. I think from that point on, until that story is corrected, we cannot see things except through the lens that says the most important thing is that we be seen as being fair to Muslims.
You know, Bush gave another speech that I think was, there were two speeches after 9/11 that I think, maybe more, but that were, he gave a speech on September 20th before the Joint Houses of Congress,
Okay.
where he laid out the cognitive framework under which America was going to be responding to the 9/11 attacks.
Right.
And he said, and that was where you coined the phrase, the axis of evil and everything. And he said there that we're going to go after every terrorist organization with global reach. And for me, that was the moment. I remember watching it. I was in America at the time. I had gotten on one of the first flights out, and flights into America after the attacks. And I was there for about, I don't know, 6 weeks or something after that. And I drove across country, and I was watching how Americans responded. Mm. And September 20th, he gives a speech, and he talks about terrorist organizations of global reach. And I said, he just said that Palestinian terrorism is okay.
To this day, Wikipedia, in its list of jihadi terror attacks, has no Palestinian attacks on
So
Israelis.
here you have the U.S. president,
Yeah.
9 days after 3,000 Americans are murdered in New York and Washington, the symbols of American power, the World Trade Center, and the Pentagon are up in flames still. There's still flames coming up.
There's still
I was
smoke
there.
coming out
You
of,
can see. And here he is saying the Jews are not part of it. Right? We are not with the Jews on this. We are throwing them to the wolves.
Yes, and that is one of the key points of my book is that by misunderstanding the Arab-Israeli conflict as freedom fighters against imperialists, rather than as jihadi imperialists against an autonomous indigenous people, the West systematically got disoriented, so they ended up applying the same logic to themselves, even though, for instance, he says axis of evil, he says war on terror. He won't say war on jihad or war on radical Islam or any. You couldn't even say those words.
He said once in his presidency, in a speech before the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, the term radical Islam. That was the only time in his entire presidency
and then
he said it.
and this was what gave me the title of my book in 2009 with the Fort Hood attack. Not only did this guy was able to shoot up people, soldiers, a Palestinian-born major in the American Army. Not only is he able to shoot up people, even though he was openly embracing jihad as a doctrine and preaching it, and nobody wanted to call on him because they didn't want to be considered racists. But afterwards, the Department of Defense put out a report in which the word radical Islam did not appear once.
And it took a Supreme Court fight to get Purple Hearts for
because it was a workplace accident. So essentially what you have is Westerners, and this gets to both the cognitive egocentrism and I think one of the driving forces behind this projection of goodwill onto everybody is a kind of virtue.
Except their own people.
Except their own people, right. Well, that, so Israel ends up being, I wouldn't want to think evil of the Muslims, but since the Muslims think evil of the Jews, I'll adopt their narrative.
But also against Americans,
right?
And Americans are going to come after Muslims after 9/11.
So I have a jihadi prayer, a Kagwar, a da'i prayer, in which he says, Allah, please give us enemies who call our terror against them as freedom fighting and call their resistance to our terrorism. And that's exactly what they got. That's what we have. So I think that on one level, you've got a close association with this liberal cognitive egocentrism, this determined projection of their good people onto the entire Muslim world, with the tiny exception of, the actually violent jihadis, but everybody else who admires them and works for them without violence is automatically given a free pass to be a good, moderate,
Erdogan.
centrist Muslim, Erdogan or CARE, the people in CARE.
Or Mohammad Zarif, the foreign minister of Iran, Rouhani.
Right. All of them. Or Yusuf al-Qaradawi was pitched as a moderate. Okay. So on the one hand, you have this, I think there's a strong connection between that and what a lot of people call either virtue signaling or moral narcissism, which is I care more about how I look than whether what I do actually is moral or has moral effects. So if I look good, there's a terrible passage in a book by, I forget her name, she's a Swedish sociologist who basically watched this poor girl end up being honor killed by her family. And it was all because, as she put it, no Swede wants to be called a racist.
Right.
So they basically sacrificed her for their self-image or projecting the image of a good person. And I think that's a lot of what was behind. We don't want America to look bad if we are hostile to our Muslim citizens, or if we hold them to account. If we say, I rewrote Bush's speech at the end of the book, and I say, one of the things he should have said is, please answer these questions. We want to know, what's your position on these matters? Make it public.
Like the Pope, right? Like
Yes.
Benedict XVI
So
did.
I discussed the Pope at the end of my chapter because it happened a couple of months after the Danish cartoon scandal.
Right, it sure did.
It calmed down. And one of the things I point out at the end of it is, if you can't laugh when somebody says, call me violent, I'll show you, and gets violent, if that's not a joke on the person who objects to being called violent by being violent, then you're in bad shape. And that was the West. The West was terrified of the response. And all of these good-thinking people in the UN and all the diplomats are pressuring.
So what we're actually talking about here, and it's even more depressing when you put it into context, because we're talking about sort of the prehistory of the self-destruction of the West. This is a setup in the Bush years, in the early years after 9/11.
Right.
But of course, then we had Obama, who came in.
Right.
And
tripled.
What did he
all
do?
Of, well, he basically, his people were formally told they couldn't use the word radical Islam.
Right.
So you have these ludicrous scenes that are on YouTube. I refer to them in the book, in
Right.
which you got, Obama, what's his
Holder.
name? Holder, saying, it's sounding like an automaton, being unable to identify radical Islam as a problem. By the way, Holder Hoffer, I wanted to say
Eric
earlier.
Hoffer.
Yes. So you were talking about Durban and stuff. Eric Hoffer has a very powerful comment in his book, The True Believer, in which he says, mass movements don't need a God, but they do need a devil.
There you go.
And that's what happened at Durban. And the irrationality that you're talking about is, in my book, a form of millennial thinking, which is, what I am doing is going to bring about redemption for mankind. I am going to make the world not just a better place, a much better place. In fact, I'm going to bring on the new age. And sometimes violence is necessary, and sometimes you have to make alliances with people who are unsavory, but they bring a lot of energy and stuff. But what's going to happen to the left if they win is what happened to the left in Iran when Khomeini took over. They'll get eaten up. They're not capable of handling the forces. They're what is it? Sorcerer's apprentices.
Well, I don't know where we can end on a happy note, because this is sort of a depressing situation. But there is, I think Prime Minister Netanyahu would argue, and here I want to go to 2 points. First is the Arabs, and then to the Israelis.
Right.
So the Arabs, you had the so-called misnamed, obviously, Arab Spring, which was really a jihadist.
It was spring for jihad.
Right, it was springtime for jihad, right? And Khomeini. But you you had this springtime for jihad, and then you had the reaction. You had the reaction to the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and in Tunis, and the Saudis, the UAE, Bahrain, and other key Muslim countries, including Egypt under al-Sisi after they got rid of the Muslim Brotherhood government led by Mohammed Morsi. You had this reassessment of Israel that led to the Abraham Accords. Said, the United States has gone stark raving mad. The Americans betrayed not only the Jews, but also the Muslims, the Sunnis, when they went with the Iranians and the Muslim Brotherhood against them.
Right.
So let's make this pact with the Jews so that we can survive this wave of jihad. So it seems like, and then all of these countries labeled Qatar and Iran terrorists, and the Muslim Brotherhood is for them, for the Americans, they're great, they're moderates, but for the UAE, the Muslim Brotherhood is a terrorist organization. So you have this awakening among non-jihad aspiring or a revulsion or walking away from jihad by these Muslim leaders, key Muslim leaders in these in Mecca, right? Is this a sign? How do you make?
Well, it could be.
So what?
It could be.
What would need to happen for it to be?
Well, what would need to happen?
I mean, they made peace with Israel,
A reconsideration, as I argue at the end of this book, of the damage done by the al-Dura story to our understanding of what's going on could go a long way towards this shift. But basically, the tragedy of the Palestinian people, Bassem Eid once said to me, the Palestinians have the worst friends and the best enemy. And the worst friends are all of these leftists who are supporting Arafat and any other Barghouti, you name it, any other radical who comes along who's sacrificing the Palestinian people to their honor revenge campaign, and they support them. And if the left were to turn against that, if the left were to look at moderate Muslims and not immediately start racking up, oh, well, they do this, they do that, they must be right-wing, there are enemies.
Or their Uncle Toms.
Right, or their Uncle Toms, then there could definitely be a significant shift. It's not going to transform the Muslim world to its core, but it would certainly create momentum in a different direction. But I think that direction is literally unthinkable to most people on the left. And I think because of the total disorientation that took at the turn of we medievalists call it the millennium.
Well, okay, because there's also Israel, right? And so Israel's new government is very conservative, it's religious, it's Zionist, nationalist, and you have leaders led by Prime Minister Netanyahu who aren't standing down, who so far, I mean, it's been around for a whole week, but insofar as the Temple Mount is concerned, insofar as Iran is concerned, the government is, and insofar as the Palestinians are concerned, and a number of other things, judicial reform here in Israel, you see domestically an open battle, pitched battle between democracy and authority, a platonic guardianship going on in real time, and this is it's something we've never seen in the past. And so Israel seems to be saying to the West, to its detractors, up yours, right? We don't take a hike. We're doing our thing. We're saying al-Dura was not killed by our people. We're walking away. We're rejecting the blood libel. What kind of effect do you think that can have?
Well, look, there's an anthropologist, historian that I really like, Victor Turner, and he talks about dramatic moments in which things can go any number of ways. I mean, essentially, every time somebody stands up to a bully, it can either lead to the bully backing down or the bully
doubling down,
picking a fight and doubling down. And so, the chorus of sort of preemptive dhimmi, ready to declare that anything that is done is a catastrophe and will lead to violence, intifada, etc., like the visit of Ben Gvir, which actually was very careful to observe all of the regulations, he didn't disturb the status quo at all, and yet people are hysterical over this. So I think that it really depends. It depends on people being able finally to say no to the kind of madness which gives us the cancel culture, which gives us the people who are afraid, professors who are afraid of their students, people who are afraid to say, wait a minute, in cases of transgender and stuff. We literally have a situation in which we're being bullied into silence. That bullying started in 2000, and by and large, we're not doing too well. On the other hand, there are people like Douglas Murray who are pushing back, and I'm trying to push back. And I do think that if people are well enough informed and courageous enough, they can push back, and it can make a difference. I mean, if we continue on the trajectory we're on, it's a disaster. I mean, there's already irreparable damage that's been done to, a generation of people who were raised under these circumstances, but I don't think it's irreversible. But, well, I can't say irreparable and it's not irreversible, but there's been serious damage done. But it's possible to rebuild, but it really takes some clarity, and for the West to understand that Israel is a democracy, and that democracy is not something you pull off the shelf and hand out. And incidentally, George Bush, one of his speeches that I discussed, which is wacko, when he goes into Iraq, it's going to be a domino effect. We'll bring democracy to them, and then the whole Middle East will become democratic. Well, no. And that's what the people who called the Arab Spring for democracy, that's what they were thinking. No, democracy is an incredibly difficult thing to do. The Jews have done it under the most extraordinary circumstances. I mean, the French Revolution took 3 years to go from democratic ideas to the terror. The Soviets, every time you get a democratic revolution that's surrounded by enemies, America's the only exception, they weren't surrounded by enemies. The French were surrounded by enemies, the Russians had enemies, and Israel was literally, and we're the only country that didn't melt down, that didn't turn into a terror, that didn't treat the opposition as if they were, expendable or even worse, exterminationists. Elimination of the enemy. The French, at one point in the French Revolution, there was a proposal to kill 150,000 German-speaking citizens of Alsace because they spoke German. So it didn't go through, but in Russia it would have, or in China it would have.
Germany it did.
Right, in Germany, right. So the point is, we have performed extraordinarily on the world stage, and yet people are so fascinated and attracted by the moral schadenfreude of pissing on us that they literally will kill themselves in order to indulge in that pleasure. And, the other quotes that gave me the title of the book wasn't just Asher Ginsburg saying, can the whole world be wrong and the Jews be right? But Kofi Annan saying at Jenin in 2002, can the whole world be wrong, including the friends of Israel, be wrong and Israel be right? Right?
And the answer would be, yeah, it sure can happen. It sure
500
can happen.
pages of yes.
500 pages of yes in Can the Whole World Be Wrong? Lethal Journalism, Anti-Semitism, and Global Jihad. Richard Landis, thank you so much for your work. Thank you so much for joining me today. And we will see you again next week. Thank you.